For me, it's an honor, and I recognize the immense breadth of and depth of knowledge on global issues, on systems theory, and the professional experience represented here. My talk today is going to be about Chinese activities in the Western Hemisphere. I will be happy to address in Q&A the very specific issues. My overarching comments, though, are going to try to call attention to some of the system characteristics of that Chinese advance. I also need to mentioned just as bookkeeping that although I'm currently employed by the U.S. Army, everything that I say today will represent my personal opinions on these matters. So with this, I'm going to go to my presentation through share screen. So if you bear with me for just a minute, you should now be able to see my presentation, Chinese Engagement with Latin America, System Dynamics and Effects. So I want to start out with the observation that in many ways, what China is doing today is remarkably consistent with what it has done in various different world systems in which it's found itself during its 3,000 plus years existence. That typically has involved looking for the security of the Chinese people. So of course, in other times in its world history of heroic efforts, significant efforts such as the 100-year construction of the Great Wall against the Mongol and other invaders from the north, but also looking for the unity of the Chinese people and trying to orchestrate a relationship between China and the various different entities, the so to speak barbarian kingdoms that it perceived it surrounding it in its periphery. So it was interesting that when China in 2013 came up with officially the Belt and Road concept, that in many ways the resurrection of a part of its past, of course the Silk Road and later the reference to the Maritime Silk Road, or even references to, for example, the treasure fleets of Xinghe. What it really illustrated was the degree to which China's project today, and of course with the 1.4 billion people and the enormous possibility of the Chinese economy as its wealth expands with that backbone of people. It's really about trying to work within the current hyper-connected, informationally and economically global system to orchestrate flows of goods and dominate value chains in that system. And again, as going all the way back to systems theory and things like limits to growth and beyond the limits of some of the classics, what you recognize is that as China increases its power and engagement, looking for that favorable economic relationship with the rest of the world, the impact on the world global economic system, as well as the world's economic and political institutions, as well as a range of other things, the world's politics, the world's financial systems, the world's value systems, frankly, is profound. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, specifically looking at Latin America. I want to say a few things about the means by which China is pursuing those aims. This is in many ways not a master plan, but I think one can discern various different patterns. Certainly as China has proceeded forward through state-led capitalism, it has made use of the lure of the size of its market in order to convince others to do certain things favorable to it, both politically and economically. It certainly made use of the financial resources that it has accumulated in its trade relationship during this past generation with the rest of the world, as well as making use of the powers of the state, not just the Communist Party, but in many ways what that state represents, which is very different than some of the tools which were possible by the communist government of the Soviet Union in a different time in world history. I would also emphasize that in many ways, China uses the advance of its products and services, as well as very self-consciously advances in key strategic technology as the repositories for pursuing that expansion and wealth. And there are many different vehicles, some more benevolent than others. We can talk about China's own investment activities, acquiring through mergers and acquisitions other companies and other key technologies. acquiring through learning on the ground, of course, acquiring through forced partnerships, and with the aid of the state, oftentimes the theft of intellectual property or processes. But overall, I would call attention to a concept that another world systems theorist, Emanuel Wallerstein, writing about Latin America long ago, would have recognized very clearly, that China in many ways is seeking to be the primary beneficiary through its state-owned companies and other companies of the accumulation of capital. And indeed, its SOEs are becoming increasingly capable and increasingly wealthy. Oftentimes, talking about China's advance globally, the reference to really the Japanese, but also the Chinese game of Go or Wei Qi is used. The thing that I believe often analysts get wrong is that while indeed one can understand what China is doing in terms of Wei Qi, a game of position, it is a game or a war for economic position more than political military position. To that extent, I would argue that many who are involved in the CEOs involving in the administration of global industries, especially multinational corporations, multi-sectoral corporations, would recognize almost more rapidly than political leaders what China's after. It is essentially value-added dominance and monopoly-seeking behavior across a range of global industries for the benefit of the Chinese people. As I hinted at before, one of the keys also for me that I will come back to later is what I would call multidimensional infrastructure orientation. Now, again, I mentioned before the Belt and Road Initiative, of which you have 19 signatories in Latin America, and some of the more recent variants, which I think are very important to focus on, for example, the digital Silk Road. But when I say multidimensional, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just the construction and dominance of physical infrastructure, as, for example, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company did in Asia centuries before, ironically, to China. But it's also, in today's interconnected global system, it's the dominance of infrastructure in terms of waterways, infrastructure in terms of electricity transmission and generation, infrastructure in terms of telecommunication infrastructure, e-commerce, data flows. And only when we look in terms of the Chinese bid to really dominate the connectivity of Latin America and other places in which it engages, and the link between dominating that connectivity, dominating sources of supply, dominating value chains, and dominating access to markets, do we understand really how China is seeking to orchestrate that economic relationship and some of the implications. And speaking of the implications, I would like to highlight what I call attention to, that for me, the economic project is the primary objective. The other things are secondary, but because of the size of China, are equally important. So China has learned over the years, as it engages with the world, that in order to pursue its economic objectives, it is needed to take a role and oftentimes work to adjust to its benefit, or at least to protect institutions from doing harm to China. Everything from the Inter-American Development Bank to UN organizations like PRC-LAC, to various multilateral organizations that span continents, such as the BRICS, et cetera, et cetera. And in global financial systems, for example, one can understand that in a world that China came into, dominated by the dollar and to a lesser extent the euro, that China recognized that its position in that global order required also the renminbi, and indirectly China's bid for global digital currency to be a key role. And I would say that these things have been accelerated, also I'll come back later, by COVID-19, among other things. I would also argue that China does not just recognize increasing multipolarity accompanying its rise, but it strategically understands that there is a value to it and its economic access in a world in which Western institutions, and certainly US institutions and US concepts of rule of law and transparency, do not dominate. So when we get into the analysis of a specific cautious positions that it has taken, for example, in Venezuela with the Chavez and now Maduro regime, recognizing that the amount of actual loans that China has outstanding in a place like Venezuela, relatively approximately $19 billion, is minimal in comparison to the strategic advantage of allowing the maintenance of challenges to a system of US economic and institutional hegemony in its own continent. Very briefly, just a little bit about the profile of China's expansion, specifically in Latin America, as we move into the Latin America part of the analysis. Again, the numbers, certainly the United States has a greater overall investment position in most of the region, although that relative strength decreases as you move away from the countries close to the United States. So as you move from Mexico to Central America and farther south, the relative importance of China's posture grows. But right now, you're looking at, in the past 20 years, an accumulation of about $123 billion of sunk investment. You're looking at about $137 billion in loans from the major PRC policy banks, so China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, which actually is more than what corresponding institutions like the World Bank have loaned to the region, as well as a current level of about $314 billion in annual bilateral trade. Now, you can see from the graphs here, which really focus on the trade part of the story, the profile of the expansion. And although there was an exponential expansion with Latin America, going all the way back to China's opening to the world beginning in 1978 and continuing through the 80s and 90s, it really wasn't until the 2001 Chinese accession into the World Trade Organization that the amount of trade began to be of notice to policymakers and businessmen in the region. I would argue that up until the global economic crisis of 2008, what you basically had was a concentration on trade. China bought a lot of things from Latin America, especially commodities, through international bodies and on commodity exchanges. China sold a lot of things, often through established multilatinas and other U.S. and other corporations. However, the Chinese footprint in the region, with a few exceptions, was relatively limited. However, a lot of things in terms of the sophistication of Chinese companies, the liquidity of those companies, the relationships in the region, the intellectual architecture, the legal architecture were growing behind the scenes. So that with that world economic crisis, I would say that after 2008, 2009, which was a bit of a perfect storm, you began to see across the board a dramatic increase in China's physical presence. In some sectors like mining and petroleum and other commodities, it was largely through mergers and acquisitions. In other sectors, such as, for example, telecommunications, it was built from the ground up by companies like Huawei and ZTE. In other sectors, such as manufacturing, it was bit by bit working with local partners. But overall, there was a relative explosion. And with that explosion of Chinese physical presence, it forced China to become much more engaged in dealing with local labor, local communities, and worry about the local political and other conditions on the ground, which actually went against China's formerly largely detached orientation towards, or agnostic orientation towards what happened politically in the region. I would argue that in recent years, especially with the slowing of Chinese GDP growth and the increasing experience in Latin America in dealing with the Chinese, a more pragmatic attitude began to emerge, understanding that China was neither the friendly panda, the lovable savior that would be an alternative source of development, nor was it the fierce dragon that would devour the region. It was a unique partner with particular challenges. However, I would argue that we are at a new inflection point just beginning right now that we will likely see continue to develop, especially in 2021 and 2022, where the transformation of the region through the COVID pandemic and other factors will lead to a new dramatic expansion in China's physical presence in the region, with a level of conflict and pushback towards China in the region and elsewhere not previously seen. I want to focus on some of the economic components, and I'll try to leave enough time for other remarks. But again, as I hinted at before, I want to focus a little bit on China's research sector activities, as well as Chinese connectivity activities and Chinese digital activities. And the overall picture that I'm trying to paint here, to reinforce something I said earlier, is this idea that really what is happening is a pursuit of an economic dominance of value-added relationships, and the extent to which China gets involved in the politics, much like a major multinational corporation, It's not about politics for politics' sake, but it's about influencing politics to further its pursuit of economic advantage and getting involved in the politics only when the local politics begin to threaten that economic pursuit. Again, very different from the era of the Cold War in the Soviet Union. I would argue that there are military and security sector activities that the Chinese plan for, but by and large, it is China is drawn into those activities in support of its economic posture globally, and in many ways, its economic posture then in turn actually drives the Chinese military and the Chinese economic in Chinese security sector to have to do certain things, including increasing focus on the Chinese police cooperation in the region, as well as even Chinese private security companies, which have begun to become increasingly active not only in Asia and now in Africa, but increasingly in looking at Latin America as well. Time will prevent me from going into all the detail, but let me just hit a few key points here. So one, in terms of the resource sector, what you can clearly see is that across the board in, for example, petroleum, largely through mergers and acquisitions, but also in mining. So in certain countries, for example, such as Peru, you find that China is actually become responsible through its companies for a significant portion of export output. So responsible now for 100% of all of Peru's iron exports and 25% of all of its copper exports, just to name a few. But you can see it goes across the board. Major mining sector presence, for example, in Peru, but also Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia indirectly, Brazil, even in Mexico most recently, even in Argentina, and certainly in Venezuela, all the secondary to petroleum, and even places like Jamaica through its acquisition of Alpart, and even in places like Guyana. I should also mention that it's not just the more common minerals, but oftentimes strategic sectors. So for modern batteries and cell phones, you see an increasingly dominant Chinese play for lithium supplies, especially in the lithium triangle. So the acquisition of a stake in the Chilean lithium deposits by Tianqi, and also in Argentina by Ganfeng, which also has a role in Mexican lithium, one of the largest fields, something that's actually relatively little known, that Mexico has a very promising lithium supply, as well as other strategic, for example, rare earth elements such as niobium, where Chinese companies have made a play again for a minority share, but increasingly a significant share of niobium deposits in Brazil, complementing what exists currently in China. In agriculture, it's interesting. This is often misrepresented. Many of China's initial attempts to go head-to-head against the major agro-industrial corporations in support of China's own food security, so things like Chongqing Grain and others fell flat, competing against ADM and Dreyfus and Cargill. What China has increasingly done, however, is it has used its capital and the demand through China Oilseeds and Food Corporation to actually acquire and basically turn companies that it has acquired like Nadera and Noble into its national champions, then using its demand to channel through those companies, really giving, again, the ADMs and Dreyfuses and Bunges of the world now reason to be concerned. Again, some dynamics of interest I just want to highlight here. Number one, acquisition. So you see actually China is moving in the resource sector from just buying promising developed plays in already mapped out in mining and petroleum to actually developing them itself. We first saw this in places like the CNOOC and CNPC play in the Libra oil field in Brazil, for example. Also move from basically through the ownership of extracted operations, operating on the ground. Those Chinese companies are becoming increasingly capable in dealing with local communities and labor. For example, China Aluminum Corporation, Chinalco, and the relative sophistication in which it basically was able to move a community of 5,000 people off of a mountain of copper, the Toromocho project in Peru, really illustrates the possibilities of learning on the ground by the Chinese. Also an important role through minority shares. It's not always just ownership. Also, the way in which, even in resources, there is important technology advances. So, for example, one of the values of the acquisition by COFCO of Nadera was to get access to their GMO seed technology. One of the advantages of the partnership in the Libre oil fields with Petrobras was to get more expertise in deep water drilling, which for Chinese oil companies is useful globally. And also, frankly, as I illustrated before, the way in which China leverages its enormous demand in order to kick open the doors in markets in areas like COFCO in Argentina, or the way in which it uses its demand for iron to basically manipulate and put against the wall some of the most powerful companies in the world, like CVRD. And we can get into the details later if you want. Obviously, again, understanding that the scale of all this means that some of the particular attributes of Chinese companies have global impacts on resources and other things. So in environment, China's often, the posture first developed in China itself of, only do environmental compliance to the degree that you're forced to do it. We've seen some, clumsy and damaging moves by Chinese companies in places like Peru and elsewhere in terms of the way in which their mining activities put at risk local access to water supplies, some of the careless ways in which they've managed their tailings ponds in mining, and certainly we can talk about in more detail IUU fishing, most recently highlighted in some of the controversies of the Chinese deepwater fleet off of Ecuador and some of the protected areas off of Chile, and of course this has been going on for more than a decade off of Argentina as well. As well as having already occurred, as well as is in Africa after China largely exhausted the major fisheries in Asia itself. Again, the scale in combination with unique characteristics of the Chinese behavior causes these global effects every place China is expanding. Again, as I mentioned before, some of the attributes of Chinese companies as they engage globally, fomenting oftentimes social conflicts. Again, when you took a look at the $6 billion buy-in of China Minmetals into the Las Bambas mine in Peru and the level of social conflict that was accompanied there, dealing with local communities and local labor issues. Similar things happened in the Mirador project in Ecuador. Similar things happened as well as in Tarapo in Ecuador, just to name a few examples. Also, frankly, there is an interesting feedback effect with respect to corruption. Specifically, you find that in many ways that some of the populist regimes in Latin America instinctively turn to China as an alternative source of funding to liberate themselves of the United States. But those regimes, so Hugo Chavez initially in Venezuela, Rafael Correa's regime before in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, those regimes, as they turn to China at the same time, are in the process of reducing Western-style transparency, consolidating their own power over other institutions that used to provide checks and balances. And so the irony is that although there's always been corruption in acquisition and other things in Latin America and elsewhere, in many ways, the attractivity of China with populist regimes means that Chinese engagement and China's willingness to engage in corrupt practices, with less oversight than, for example, the U.S. with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, means that advance, especially in the populist countries, has been one, although not the only, driver of expanding corruption. And in other places where you have personalistic, weakly institutionalized, smaller regimes, such as in the Caribbean, you see similar phenomenon, although not directly tied to populism. Also, as I mentioned before, the role of China very self-consciously bringing in not only its own workers wherever possible where it can negotiate it, but also its own subcontractors in terms of petroleum service companies, engineering companies, et cetera, and basically bringing along with its manufacturers their own preferred suppliers and supply chains. So again, as I've talked about here, there really is a desire not to be nefarious, but in trying to orchestrate a world to the benefit of the Chinese, to dominate value-added chains, which means that over time, these activities, arguably that there is a loss of sustainable value added to the partner societies that need it most, and a drift of that value added in ways, again, that somebody like a Raoul Prebisch or Emmanuel Wallerstein would have recognized the benefit going to Chinese companies, although with some local workers and managers. And again, when you have this amount of money involved, again, the use of the decisions about where to invest in order to begin to exercise leverage over politics, not because it seeks Soviet-style control, but leverage over politics in those areas where politicians think about impacting the images of, or the interests of Chinese companies. Let me talk a little bit about connectivity. So I just want to highlight here that the area of, for example, physical infrastructure construction. Again, China is very active in the port sector, not just the Hutchison Whampoa ports, but in the construction and operation of ports from Pasorja in Ecuador to São Luís in Brazil, a number in the works in the Caribbean, Caicedo and Dominican Republic, some talked previously, La Union in El Salvador, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of highways and bridges, although a lot of the big signature projects by the Chinese, like the Twin Ocean Railways, have not gone forward, there have been many smaller projects across the board in places like Bolivia. Argentina, of course, just announced a major expansion in Chinese work on Belgrano Cargas and other basically rail infrastructure modernization. And the interesting thing, the Chinese are also moving into the increasing use, not just of government deals like we saw in Africa, but investing some of their own capital to get liberalized procurement rules, basically the use of public-private partnerships. And it's interesting that the acquisition by one of the largest Chinese conglomerates, China Communication and Construction Corporation, of the Portuguese firm Mota Engel, is an illustration of some of the ways that through acquisition, the Chinese are buying expertise that they need. Here, they're buying basically into a company which has substantial experience on the ground in Latin America and elsewhere, and substantial experience that will help them more effectively do PPP, public-private partnership projects. Again, it's not just physical infrastructure, it's also hydro routes. So for example, a significant and almost completely overlooked thing that's going on with respect to the bid to displace the Belgian firm Jan de Nul, with respect to the Paraguay and Paraná River hydrovia, which would basically give a Chinese company, Shanghai Dredging, control over a critical route that is vital for the agricultural exports of 5 South American countries, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and portions of Brazil. You also find clustering, the way that the Chinese bring together work, for example, not just building out a port, but port, rail, other supporting activities, et cetera, et cetera. The Chinese are also moving from building into more operating. So you see, again, the operation of ports increasingly under their control, especially now in Brazil. You see the move towards the operation, not just the construction of roads, but the operation long-term of toll roads, such as the North-South Highway, such as the 4G highway in Colombia that goes from Medellin up to the coast to the Gulf of Urabá. Obviously the Bogota Metro, just to name a few, and of course the hydrovias, the one I just mentioned, the Paraguay Paraná River hydrovia, which would basically be operated, not just built by Shanghai Dredging. Also, it's not just transportation infrastructure. Beginning in Brazil, the Chinese have increasingly gotten into electricity generation and transmission. In addition to the facilities, 6 hydroelectric facilities in Ecuador, 3 in Bolivia, the acquisition of the Chagia facility in Peru, major Chinese plays not only building, but often operating wind and solar facilities, including 2 of the biggest in South America, in the Atacama Desert in Chile, as well as the Cachari in Argentina in the north, which would be actually, I think, the biggest in the Western Hemisphere, as well as even in nuclear. But it's not just generation and not just in renewables, but it's also in transmission. So 3 major Chinese companies, State Grid, China Three Gorges, and SPIC, have invested over $20 billion just in Brazil. There have recently been increasingly important moves in Peru and in Chile. Indeed, the acquisition of Naturgy in Chile just recently, on top of previous acquisitions, gives the Chinese potentially control or influence over almost half of Chilean generation capability. Again, just to mention very briefly, in technology, it's not just 5G, but it's also the operation for both commercial and government providers of other infrastructures, 3G and 4G infrastructures, the things that you hang on those infrastructures. So increasingly a Chinese presence, Alibaba, Tencent, others in e-commerce, as well as e-commerce related activities such as Didi, as well as Didi in Brazil. All of which China talks about under Digital Silk Road. My key point, though, in going through this long list and really talking about the evolution of Chinese influence, is this is a model that those accusing Google or Microsoft of monopoly-seeking behavior would have recognized intuitively. Basically, China is increasingly, in Latin America, among other places, taking a significant amount of control over not just physical connectivity, but economic connectivity that underlines almost the entire Latin American commercial landscape. And again, in combination with its increasing role in the resources I talked about, again, it's another leg of the stool. Very briefly on digital, we can come back to this because I know that I want to leave an adequate amount of time, but I would just highlight the fact that in addition to telecom infrastructure, which also includes fiber optic lines connecting to Cote d'Ivoire from Brazil, as well as Chile going to Hong Kong or maybe Australia, but also relevant is surveillance architecture such as ECU 911 or BOO 110, or some of the other basically camera facial recognition systems in Panama or in Uruguay and the border. A broader dimension this also is in smart cities. So in every place from northern Brazilian states to even places like Guyana, increasingly integrating surveillance technology, financial data, transportation system. So there is an implicit understanding of an acceptance of a loss of privacy when one does that in China. But increasingly, as China exports these types of architectures to other parts of the world, it not only provides important intelligence collection opportunities, but also implicitly it begins to export China's model of what I would call digital authoritarianism and social credit. And then, of course, there are feedback effects in this because as China increasingly dominates the technologies and sets technology standards, whether in artificial intelligence or 5G, et cetera, China increasingly wins projects because it is its standards and its technology. This is already a major problem in 5G and how to deal with the really cost competitive offering of Huawei, for example, vis-a-vis others such as Nokia. And frankly, again, there's a political feedback loop, which is interesting here because as China exports these digital technologies, as we saw with CEIEC in Venezuela or the Fatherland Identity Card, you find that these very technologies are useful in helping China keep authoritarian governments in power that favor it. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of these other things, but we can come back in Q&A. I would just like to talk about this idea that there is a significant amount of suppression of debate in Chinese soft power, which has a lot to do with the expectation of commercial and other benefit, or at least fear of losing China's benefit. And so the bigger China gets economically and the more China is disposed to use these tools, the more it cements Chinese advantage and suppresses the debate. But the more it suppresses the debate, the more difficult it gets for governments to have open mobilization against the risks that China poses, not only economically, but in other ways. Very briefly, I had mentioned significant Chinese space activities across both populist states as well as others such as Brazil. I would also mention that there is military engagement in terms of arms sales, training, professional military activities, and other things. But I wanted to end on this slide and then leave it open to questions. Specifically, as I suggested before, in multiple different ways, I would argue that the COVID-19 pandemic, whether or not you say that this was orchestrated by the Chinese, I believe creates a significant shift, basically unleashes basically a number of different positive feedback loops that were already there, but really by upsetting the previous equilibrium, takes us to a different system state. So one of the things we saw, obviously, is because China represents, through its projected 8% economic growth this year, basically the only major country which is going to be growing, especially in terms of demand for agricultural products. If you're Brazil or Argentina, China becomes increasingly important as a trading partner over the EU or US. Many of the shuttered companies in Latin American value chains, China has opportunities to move in because of that very shuttering and the financial weakness of those, especially the small and medium enterprises that were important, have been important in Latin America. You have a prospect for, as we saw in 2008 and 2009, again, as the immediate effects of the pandemic recede, and basically you're going to have, like you had in 2008, US and European and Asian companies looking to shore up their financial positions by divesting of assets in weakly performing markets like Latin America. So who's there to basically pick up those assets in strategic sectors but the Chinese? And so in many ways, just like in 2008, with about a year or two delay till 2010, all of a sudden you saw this takeoff through M&A. I would say that in 2021, 2022, we're going to begin to see what we're already just beginning, the takeoff of Chinese physical presence in the region. As well as, again, you have multiple other reinforcing dynamics. So you have governments with greatly weakened financial positions and Western institutions which have limited abilities to continue to bail them out. And so, Ecuador has already taken a $2.4 billion major new line of credit with the Chinese. Argentina, with its new left-leaning government with Alberto and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, you have the prospect, again, to complement the IMF package and China to come in, not only in terms of the investment deals, but also building on some of its previous financial relationships, like the debt swap agreement, to come in and begin to help out the Argentine government. And again, if you look at the resurgence of leftist governments across the region, so the return of the MAS in Bolivia, again, I mentioned in Argentina, the survival of the Chavistas with Maduro in Venezuela, the possible return of the left in Ecuador. So you see, you have the political dynamics which reinforce openings for China to provide these loans. And in some cases, it's not just the political or fiscal need, but it's the need for Chinese investment. So for example, China already has a major role in the first portion of the signature project of the AMLO government in Mexico, the Tren Maya, as well as already a foothold in the Perdido Basin with Pemex and the Dos Bocas refinery. And the more that AMLO in Mexico wants to basically increase oil production without Western equity investment, the more they're going to turn to China, as they already have. The same thing with electricity generation through CFE in Mexico. But again, to wrap this up, I think the other thing that you see is that there are a number of reasons why that as China's footprint increases, once again, in Mexico, or in Latin America, you also will have another type of feedback effect, which is a lot more mistrust and violence. Number one, because there already has been mistrust towards the Chinese company going into this, especially related to COVID. But on top of that, new Chinese companies, especially SOEs, routinely take a while to figure out the relationship with local communities. And so they make errors that oftentimes exacerbate labor problems, environmental problems, et cetera. And so you're going to see a lot more of that as new Chinese companies come in. You're also going to see other questions, because Chinese companies are coming in an environment in which, because of COVID, you will have higher levels of crime, higher levels of desperation and competition for employment, higher levels of social mobilization because of the discontent with Latin American governments. And so in many ways, there's a cauldron. I think that you're going to have pressures for China to have to defend its interests in a way that goes much beyond what happened with the previous surge of Chinese physical presence in 2010 to 2012. And again, I think you're also going to have a secondary opportunity for the China-Taiwan diplomatic competition to play out, especially in Central America and in the Caribbean. And anytime you have a change in diplomatic recognition, it represents an opportunity to have an exponential increase in Chinese economic influence, because you have basically MOUs and sometimes FTAs, which open up the market. You have the changing out of a Taiwan-oriented elite to a new elite, which now goes to Chinese facilities. You have the buying off of politically well-connected local businessmen. So I think we'll see the opportunity for this to play out as well. So again, I've covered a lot of space, but really what I'm trying to illustrate here is the way in which this broader global trend of China seeking to rewire the world to its own economic benefit is playing out with economic, political, and social repercussions with multiple feedback effects, hypercharged by what has just happened with COVID. And I think you're going to see that playing out in Latin America, just as it's playing out in different ways that I have not talked about in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and in other places. So again, thank you very much for your time. My apology for going a little bit over, but I'm at your disposal for as long as you wish to respond to questions and questions and comments.